Everyone. I see folks starting to join us. We'll give folks just a few minutes to trickle into the meeting, but if you are here for exploring climate migration in the classroom with the Pulitzer Center, ProPublica, and New York Times Magazine reporting, you are in the right place. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you're coming in, I want to ask you to open up your chat box and look at the little menu on your right-hand side. There will be an option at the bottom of your screen to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can read your comments and reflections throughout. And go ahead and open that up and let us know what's your name and where are you based in the world right now? Where are you coming to us from? My name is Hannah Burke. I work for the Pulitzer Center K-12 education team, and I am coming to you today from my house in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by a couple colleagues and a wonderful featured journalist. So can we start with Pauline? Can you introduce yourself for folks and tell us where you are?
Sure. Welcome, everybody. My name is Pauline. I also work on the education team at the Pulitzer Center, and I'm coming to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Pauline. Abrahm, can you say hello to everybody?
Hi, folks. Thrilled to be here. I'm Abrahm Lustgarten. I'm a senior reporter at ProPublica and did the reporting and research into how climate change would drive global migration.
Thank you. So excited to have you today. And Fareed.
Hi, everybody. I'm Fareed Mostofi from the K-12 education team at the Pulitzer Center based in Washington, D.C. Very excited to spend this time with you all.
Thank you so much. We are so excited to be here with you. Pauline, can you let us know what some folks are sharing in the chat box right now?
Sure. We have folks coming from all over the world and the country. We have some coming from Ontario, British Columbia, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Mexico, Quito, Ecuador, Utah, all over the place.
That's really wonderful to see. This is a very global story, and we're excited to hear your perspectives on this, both how this the subject is affecting you, how you think it'll resonate with your students based on the different experiences that we're all bringing to the table here. So thank you for sharing your time with us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. And before Abrahm begins sharing with you some of his own reporting and some of this climate migration data and human stories, we're going to talk a little bit about where we're coming from today. So first, we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction to the Pulitzer Center and how we work with journalists to get underreported stories the attention that they deserve. We're going to take a look at some resources for educators that have been developed surrounding climate migration today. And that will lead into a wonderful presentation from Abrahm, who will be sharing with you some of the groundbreaking reporting that has been recently published in ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine. After that, we'll have a chance to ask Abrahm lots of questions, so please feel free to start jotting those down in the Q&A box as soon as you begin to have those questions during his presentation, and we'll get to those at the end. Stick around at the end of our session for a little bit of a closing and a feedback survey, which will help us continue sustaining these programs and understand how to better serve you in our educator webinars going forward. A couple logistical notes before we get started. This is a Zoom webinar. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this space by now. Your video is already off and your microphone is muted, so we'll be using the Q&A and chat functions to communicate today. You can use that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen in the middle there. If anytime that you have a question that you want to ask a presenter, whether it's about education resources or about the story that Abrahm has told, we'll get to those questions toward the end of our presentation today. If you have any immediate tech questions or concerns, you can use the chat box, and that's also a great place to share any reflections or responses to what you're seeing and hearing, any personal anecdotes or experiences that you want to bring into the mix today. Make sure that you've set that chat box to all panelists and attendees. The automatic setting is just all panelists, so if you have it on that, only the four of us will be able to see what you're saying. Set it to all panelists and attendees to make sure that our whole community can hear from you today. We want to acknowledge that we're all coming together today at a difficult time for many reasons. All over the world, we're dealing with the fallout of a pandemic. Here in the US and in many places around the world, we're dealing with racial justice uprisings and reckonings with national memory and history. So we appreciate you spending your time with us today and ask you to please take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Feel free to step away if you need to anytime during this presentation. And also know that we have resources available and want to connect with you to make our resources responsive to your circumstances right now. So we've been developing a lot of printable activities, a lot of classroom resources that can be facilitated digitally for remote learning, and a lot of resources that are topical and responsive to this moment. But we'd love to connect with you and hear more about what you need. So always feel free to reach out to us. I want to get started by telling you just a little bit about the Pulitzer Center itself and how we work with journalists and news outlets across the country and around the world. This is a brief snapshot of some of the news outlets that the Pulitzer Center works with as a grant giver. We give funding to journalists to report on various underreported stories that they pitch to the center, and these stories are published in all different outlets, usually over 150 different outlets every year. These are some of the large-scale outlets. You'll see the New York Times up here, one of the outlets we'll be talking about today. And we also work with much smaller local publications as well, both in the US and outside. These stories range in topics from children and youth, stories of public health, increasingly right now, stories about human rights, racial justice, LGBTQIA rights, migration and refugees, environment and climate change, many different specific topics that are not limited to what you see on your screen here today. What they all have in common is that they're underreported stories that aren't getting the attention that they always deserve in our major news headlines, and they're passion projects for the journalists who come to us with these ideas and want to share them with the world. We also know that these stories need our efforts to make sure that they don't just disappear in the news cycle, but resonate with multiple generations and different audiences in an ongoing way. So we work with schools at the K-12 level and the campus, college, and university level as well. Part of the reason that we do this is because students recognize that the news is important and have a fairly idealistic view of what news can be and do in our communities. A 2017 Common Sense Media study found that 70% of students, the majority in the 10 to 18-year-old range, feel smart and knowledgeable after engaging with news, and they feel like it equips them to better take action in their communities. But they also find that there are significant obstacles to staying informed, which include negative responses emotionally to that media, such as feeling sad or depressed, angry, and afraid based on the headlines. And they also feel like the news isn't covering the issues that matter to them, that news is complicated and hard to follow, and that they're often not seeing themselves in these stories. So what we want to do at the Pulitzer Center is help students follow their interests, identify those underreported stories that are interesting to them and that do matter to their communities, as well as help equip them with some of those journalism skills to fill in some of the gaps themselves and tell stories from their own communities. So ultimately, the Pulitzer Center education team mission is to cultivate a more curious, informed, empathetic, and engaged public by connecting students and teachers with underreported global news stories and the journalists who cover them. So how do we do that? We do that through many different programs, which include making sure that the journalism that we support in all of these news outlets is freely accessible online without a paywall. We also turn that journalism into lesson plans, standards aligned for K-12 classrooms that help us engage with both media literacy skills, global issues content, and also creative expression. We bring the journalists behind these stories into classrooms as a lesson in news literacy and action and what responsible ethical journalism practices really look like. And we also hold webinars, which are large and open to anybody to join that help students connect with journalists that way. We do workshops for students and teachers, which involve journalism skills, media literacy skills, and working toward projects that they can take ownership of. And we also elevate student voice through contests that we can talk about a little bit more in a moment. Some of the opportunities that you have available to bring into your classroom this fall include these free virtual journalist visits that we've been hosting for many years now. You can write to the Pulitzer Center education team and let us know what you're working on in your classroom, what skills and content you want to make sure is highlighted, and we can find a journalist who aligns with that subject matter and those skills, who can bring that real world experience into the classroom and answer questions for students. We also have a fall letter writing contest available to bolster the civic engagement that students can respond to in the news. So during election season, we're asking students to identify a global news story that they feel is going underreported in this time, and to explain it and summarize it in a way that makes other people care about it as much as they do, and then argue for a solution to that issue by writing a letter to their local representative. This contest is open to all educators around the world for grades K through 12. We'll have a series of professional developments for educators, including some quickly upcoming professional developments. On September 2nd, we'll be doing a sort of overview of the opportunities that we have for the fall, going a lot more in depth into some of these things, and having some interactive conversations with our fellow educators as part of a Zoom meeting. So we'll get to know each other a little bit better. And then on September 16th, we have another webinar for educators based on climate change and some reporting out of the Great Lakes region, if you're interested in getting another angle on this really important issue and story. In addition to our open webinars for all teachers to join, we have a special opportunity this fall in the form of a teacher fellowship for teachers in grades 4 through 12. So please take a look at this fellowship on our website or contact us to learn more about it. There are tracks for exploring misinfodemics and COVID-19, as well as art, justice, and journalism and their potential in the classroom. So we would love to see your applications for this opportunity as well. Finally, we have lesson plans on our website that delve into many of these issues. They can be topical, like lessons exploring voter suppression in the current US elections. They can be more timeless and skill-based, such as lessons exploring media representation and bias in photography. And they can do a little bit of both, introducing global issues and skills, such as this lesson that we're going to be delving into a little bit today on how data predicts the Great Climate Migration, learning about both journalism skills and this issue of climate migration in the world. So that's a lot about some of the general resources and opportunities that we have available to students and educators this fall and always. And just to sort of close us out on the Pulitzer Center front, I want to ask folks, and Pauline, if I can ask you to launch our poll for us. I'm curious which of these resources, if any, you think would be useful for you and your students. Is it the open access news resources that you would like to bring into your classroom? Would lesson plans be helpful to you? Virtual journalist visits and webinars to directly interact with journalists? Professional development opportunities, or maybe student contests as well? So we'll take just a couple seconds and we'll close out our poll in 5, in 4, in 3, in 2, in 1. And let's see our results. Okay, so we're pretty all across the board here, from news resources, lesson plans, connections with journalists, and professional development, which is great to see because that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. We'll be taking a look at all 4 of these resources as part of our presentation today, both interacting directly with a journalist, just as students would be able to do in your classrooms, getting a look at some of that open access news, of course doing professional development, and finally getting into some of our lesson plan resources on our website. And to take a greater look at what some of those lessons can look like in the classroom in action, I want to turn it over to Pauline Werner, who is the author of a lesson plan on the Great Climate Migration, the wonderful story that we'll be exploring with Abrahm in just a few minutes today. So Pauline, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you so much, Hannah. So like Hannah said, all of our different educational resources are based first and foremost on the excellent reporting done by all of our grantees. And the reporting that we're going to be spotlighting today is The Great Climate Migration, which is a collaborative effort between the New York Times Magazine, ProPublica, and the Pulitzer Center to tell the story, to investigate the impact of climate change on human migration. And it tells the story of climate migration using innovative data modeling techniques, which can help us predict how climate change will interact with migration as well as public policy. And it also uses, and in order to tell this story, Abrahm also traveled to Guatemala and to Mexico and within the United States to learn from people who have had to leave their homes as a result of global warming. So Hannah, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. So we have one question to ask you, and I'll go ahead and launch our second poll. What, in your opinion, is the most compelling way to tell the story of climate migration? Is it using individual human narratives? Is it using macro level data models that help us see the big picture? Or is it a combination? We're going to close down our poll in just a few more seconds. All right, and poll. Let's see. It looks like most of us think that the most compelling way to do so is using a combination of these two tools. And that's exactly what we're going to hear Abrahm tell us a little bit more about really soon. And our hope also is that this presents an opportunity for students to engage with this important topic from multiple different angles. So Hannah, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. So, using this incredible resource, my colleagues and I at the Pulitzer Center created a lesson plan that provides a framework for bringing it into the classroom. It features activities, discussion questions, as well as extension activities that are designed to reach an upper middle school and high school audience with opportunities for more advanced college students to access it as well. So the first component, the warm-up, asks students to consider both climate change and migration as separate issues and then make predictions about how they can be interconnected before reading the reporting. Next, students read this reporting in 4 different parts. Oh, sorry. If you could go back, thank you. So next, students will read the reporting in 4 different parts with comprehension questions in between and learn the stories that Abrahm worked so hard to uncover, as well as understand how data can be a tool for putting together journalism. Next, there are 5 discussion questions that educators can use to spark conversations between students in the classroom. And finally, there are 3 extension activities, which provide opportunities for students to go further in their investigation and their conversations about these issues. They can do so using visual arts, as well as with a data science project. And there are also opportunities for students to delve into more Pulitzer Center supported reporting, which explores the ways in which climate change intersects with other pressing global issues, some of which are COVID-19, indigenous sovereignty, and others. So Hannah, if you wouldn't mind, we have one more poll for our educators here. So before hearing from Abrahm, we want to give you an idea of what the kinds of conversations that this reporting can spark in the classroom. So, for example, do countries that produce much of the world's emissions, like the United States, have an obligation to accept people fleeing from climate change? Yes or no? And we'd love to hear your reflections on that front in the chat box. We'll give people just a few more seconds to share their answers. All right. So we are overwhelmingly saying yes, which is interesting. And I'm sure that we'll have Abrahm tell us a little bit more about the challenges that poses in just a few minutes. But overall, this question, like the others that are explored in the lesson plan, are designed to get students thinking about not just one pressing global issue, but how it can interconnect with others that they feel passionate about and that they feel connected to their communities. And finally,
so Pauline, I'm seeing some good answers in our chat box here to the prompt to explain your answer in the chat box. So thank you for sharing. Many people are alluding to the responsibility that a country has and a moral obligation, as Patricia says, and Renee as well. We need to create a safe space, says Barbara. every country has an obligation to accept refugees for any reason. It's a global citizen obligation, says Abigail. And also to provide resources and resources for development and to reduce emissions, says Yasmin. Yes, but defining a climate refugee is the tricky part, says Adam. So a lot of really interesting nuance coming out of these answers in the chat box, and please continue to share those. Thank you so much.
Those are all fascinating reflections, and those are certainly important questions to grapple with as we move into reckoning with what the role of climate change will be in determining migratory flows into the future. Erin says we have an even greater obligation to reduce and reverse the negative impacts that prompt migration in the first place. So true. Thank you, Erin. So overall, we just wanted to give you guys give you all a sense of what kind of conversations and what explorations this reporting can spark in the classroom. So, and again, as Hannah mentioned, we would be happy to connect your students directly with Abrahm or any other journalists in order to engage directly with the issues that they feel most connected to. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Abrahm, a senior environmental reporter at ProPublica and the reporter and the researcher on this fascinating piece of reporting. Abrahm?
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me today. I also want to thank the Pulitzer Center for the support of this project. It's an essential piece to getting the work that we've done over the last 2 years done. And I'm really looking forward to telling you a little bit about it today. So let me tell you a little bit about myself for starters. The only professional job I've ever had is as a journalist. I've worked as a photographer, off and on, documentary photographer, sports journalist, and an investigative reporter since about 1997, starting at a small daily newspaper in Colorado, eventually at Fortune magazine, going to ProPublica at its founding in 2008, and where I've pretty much been ever since. I was drawn to journalism basically for its opportunity to satisfy my curiosity. I was an anthropology student in my undergraduate studies, loved to travel, loved to see the world, and journalism is a way to both observe and absorb, what happens in the world, but also an opportunity to focus some attention on the issues and the places that I think deserve more attention, and in many cases, in the case of investigative work, to demand some, degree of correction or accountability for those issues, which is a force that I find both inspiring and empowering, and drives a lot of the work that I do. So, in 2009, to give you an idea of some of the work that I've done in the past, environmental work, I did some of the earliest reporting on the risks from fracking. Did a significant project over a couple of years about the Colorado River water supplies. A significant project about how the United States disposes of its waste, hazardous waste and toxic waste underground, which really gets into some of the geologic science of what happens beneath our feet. And then a significant investigation into the defense industry, its toxic legacy, how it's influenced human toxicology reviews of contaminants and really shaped what chemicals and environmental substances we consider a risk to people in the United States. So much of this work over many years has had a very scientific focus. It's drawn on technical details of peer-reviewed papers and journals and symposiums and conferences and interviews with researchers directly, which is a little bit of a more kind of down in the weeds technical part of reporting than a lot of mainstream media goes for. The past couple of years have been more exclusively focused on climate change. And about 2 years ago, after I finished the last project that I had done with the New York Times Magazine, together we brainstormed this, what became a deep dive into the issue of migration and how people will live with a changing climate. We'd heard a lot of loose speculation, as I'm sure most people have, about this idea of climate refugees. Who are climate refugees? Where will they be coming from? Under what circumstances? What's the scope of the impact that they will have in the world? And we hope to both tell that story, because it seemed like an underrepresented issue in the climate conversation, but also to try to tell it with some degree of precision. the first couple months of reporting, there was a lot of groundwork that went into this. We're really spent talking with agencies and experts around the world, the United Nations, the International Organization on Migration, the World Food Program, reading an enormous volume of reports and journals and peer-reviewed papers. And what I learned immediately, and I can tell from some of your questions that you already know this, which is that migration is very, very complicated. People move for lots of reasons. Those reasons are often interconnected and they're mutually causal, and it makes it very difficult to talk very clearly, about one factor in isolation, other than perhaps the most extreme, which is war or conflict. Did a person move because heat caused their economy to collapse, or did a person move because their economy collapsed and the heat was inconvenient? Those sorts of questions. But despite the ambiguity, there was a very, very clear consensus of two things. One is that globally, heat-induced food shortages would rise, that there would be rising food insecurity and increasing difficulty in growing food supplies pretty much around the planet, but especially in the hottest parts of the planet. And the second was that a mass movement of people of some magnitude and in some direction would result, and that also that could be expected to come mostly from those equatorial regions. When we looked at the body of research about climate and migration, there was a lot to be said about uprooted people and how people would become uprooted. There was a lot of research about instability and conflict that could result from it. Studies connecting, for example, the Syrian conflict or the Arab Spring uprisings to environmental causes or droughts that led to urbanization that led to those conflicts. There was a lot of research about the urgency to act and to prepare for this movement of people. A focus on the need for urban planning, for jobs in receiving communities, for adequate housing, adequate water supplies, and things like that. And there was a great deal of research about, there was very little that connected the dots between these issues. And that was really the problem that we saw, looking at specifically who would move, where would they go, what preparations would be needed for these people. And so giving each of these kind of conclusions of research a little bit of direction, a little bit of a pointed target became my goal. Could we start to predict and have a conversation about which communities, which governments need to prepare for exactly what kind of impacts as people began to move around the planet? So as you start to think about conceiving this story from my perspective, it would ideally serve two ends. It could educate people, readers, governments maybe, about the enormous importance and size of global migration. And it could try to quantify and predict that migration, maybe in a way that opened a discussion about what to do about it, how to prepare for it, how to maybe prevent it from happening. And to that end, one component of the project was an enormous data modeling ambition. I had this fantasy that I could go and collect all the data that existed, how many people lived where, and what the temperature changes have been in those places, and what water availability is in those places, and so forth, and kind of do the ultimate data analysis about identifying what determines how a person moves and when they move and where they move to. It almost like artificial intelligence. We could predict the future that way. As I'll tell you in a little bit, I quickly learned how nearly unrealistic that is, and daunting in effort. But the World Bank had done something similar, and I'd come across it early in my reporting. However, it only looked at internal migration within a couple countries and within a couple of hotspots that they chose to study. And so they did look at how rising food insecurity and rising temperatures would lead to an uproot or a displacement of people, and how those people would move within those countries. But they didn't consider how they would move across borders, which is really the kind of international movement that leads to the tensions and real evolution of global and geopolitical issues that I was most interested in. So we hired a geographer that had developed the model for the World Bank, and we hired them to target our work to be a little bit more sensitive to some of the environmental inputs that I was interested in, and to expand that model to try to understand how people would move across international borders. The other component, of course, to all of this reporting and this project was on-the-ground reporting. I was happy to see that in your poll that most of you think that a combination of data analysis and on-the-ground reporting or real storytelling is the right way to go, because that's what I was after. It's this ground reporting that can help to bring these issues alive, put a face to numbers, really kind of try to make an emotional connection. And personally, I wanted to get inside people's head, another perhaps naive, feeling that I had at the beginning of this project, but I wanted to understand human decision making. If someone is driven by environmental factors to leave a farm in Guatemala, how do they weigh their pros and cons and what's in their columns, and how do they check their list before they decide to make that big move? I chose Central America for on-the-ground reporting for this project, both because it's a hotspot of change. Central American countries will endure some of the most extreme change and the fastest change over the next couple of decades. And obviously, it has this physical connection to the U.S. border and directly relates to to the caravans and the pressures we're seeing on the border at the time that I began the project last year. The World Bank had focused some of its work in North Africa and also in Central Asia, which are homes to much larger populations, which will be similarly affected and could just as easily have been a way to go in this reporting. Let me skip for a moment, telling you more about the reporting process, which I will do, and tell you what we learned, and then I'll kind of circle back and tell you a little bit more about that process. The work shows what our modeling and all of my reporting shows that people will move. They'll move in large numbers, and the data modeling supported and reinforced what I learned in the field and from the peer-reviewed papers and researchers, which is that people will move increasingly as the climate gets hotter. The data modeling gives us a sense of the scale and the direction of that movement. The more the emissions, the more the migrants, the more people will be displaced. And the data modeling goes a little bit further, and this is its real value, I think. It makes explicit that none of this unfolds as a foregone conclusion. That different government policy responses can make a dramatic difference in the outcome and the welfare of millions of people. That open borders, foreign aid, urban planning, investment, climate policy, of course, that they all lead to significant differences in how people migrate, how many people are trapped at home, what their relative welfare is or food supply is. And these are the things that in turn affect stability, violence, potentially uprisings in some of those countries. And so in the end, it frames a choice. And even though this is projected and speculative into the future, it sets parameters for accountability because it gives governments tools to act or a sense of how they should act and a measure of response. And if that doesn't happen, as we have seen in our response to the COVID crisis, for example, then we have a baseline to compare it to. And it makes it also clear that the climate crisis won't just be uncomfortable, but that it's going to have a real human cost. And we talk about that kind of in abstract terms a lot, but don't really get at what that means for individual people. And what this means and what this research told us is that perhaps a third of the planet's population will need a place to go eventually as a result of climate change. So I want to share my screen with you, and I'll just share some photos of where I went as I tell you a little bit about the reporting process. So last May, I began reporting in the field in El Salvador, in rural and remote parts of Guatemala's mountains, and in southern Mexico, and then eventually at the US border in El Paso, Texas. This is a photograph by Meredith Kohut, who's an absolutely unbelievable photographer that I worked with on this project, who was until recently based in Venezuela, and whose pictures I just find incredibly emotionally evocative. And this is a picture of one of about 6 families that I spent significant time with over the weeks that I was reporting down there. Who they're standing in a field of land that they leased and a maize crop, a corn crop that never produced any fruit, which is their main food supply in this town of Alta Verapaz, which is a state in Guatemala. So we went to Guatemala. Alta Verapaz is in the Central Mountains. It's part of the dry corridor in Guatemala. As I mentioned, and we all know the U.S. was in the midst of a migration crisis last year, and many of those migrants were from Guatemala. I chose Alta Verapaz because it didn't have the same ties to the U.S. That other parts of Guatemala had, where we were hearing about a lot of migrants, coming from there to the United States. So people in Alta Verapaz, they weren't familiar with the idea of migration as a solution to their problems. As indigenous communities, the environmental change they're experiencing, less water or wildly variable water supplies was making it increasingly hard for them to grow their crops. And they were really grappling for the first time with what to do about it. This is just a couple, give you a sense of where I was and where I was working. What I found when I got there was, to me, really a shocking level of hunger and destitution. And I've reported around the world, and still just a heartbreaking degree of need, especially among children, and just a painful experience among their parents of trying to feed their children. And it led me to this very quick realization, which was that this is me in one of kind of a typical village setting of where we're working. I talked about how I wanted to go and look at these columns of pros and cons and dissect this decision-making process that people faced. And what I found when I was there is that the people in this part of the world, they didn't have any choice at all. That they were acting out of pure desperation. That by the time that they decided to pack up their things and say goodbye to their families, and use every asset that they had, try to move to Guatemala City or to the United States, that they were acting out of absolute pure desperation. It was pretty much the only choice that they had. This is the family of the man whose story I began my story with, Jorge, who now lives in Houston, and had left this part of Guatemala about 6 weeks before my arrival. Just some tough travel through the country to give you a sense of what it's like getting around. And we went from Alta Verapaz. When I finished that part of the reporting, we drove by truck over the highlands and into El Salvador, and made our way to San Salvador, which is where we are here with this picture. So one of the trends in global migration is a pattern, not always followed, but common, which is this, it's called stepwise migration. Is a transition from rural areas or lack of food leads people to move to the nearest larger place, and often to large cities. And then most often from those large cities on across borders and maybe to the United States when they're unable to meet to satisfy the needs, economic needs, or safety needs that drove them to the cities in the first place. So San Salvador is an example of a very fast-growing metropolitan area and a rapidly urbanizing country, El Salvador, and emblematic of this kind of stepwise migration. And that was where this is a papusa stand on the street, where I met the woman Edelvira Cortez, who became the subject for the second chapter in my story. And that's her there with her baby, and then her niece, her sister's child in the background. So Edelvira's story is kind of an example of the difficulty of defining what a climate refugee or a climate migrant is, and also how a non-climate migrant can actually be, or someone that seems like they're not a climate migrant can actually be a climate refugee. She had moved to San Salvador because of violence. Her husband was murdered, but she had moved away from her home because drought had made it impossible for them to farm. After her husband was murdered, she would have liked to move back home if it were not for the complete lack of opportunity that existed there because of ongoing drought and an impossibility of getting work in the fields. This is, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but this is an example in El Salvador of a World Food Program endeavor to build greenhouses where they've just had enormous success in taking farmers really kind of at the end of the rope and giving them a system where they've been able to grow really productive and abundant crops and recover very, very quickly at a relatively low cost of aid. This is me and my fixer and my translator, who I worked with, Pedro Solares, who I worked with here in San Salvador. This is Meredith Kohut's photographs as we moved into Mexico of the transition of migrants moving northward. Mexico, my reporting turned to focus on the hardship of the journey, the seeds of conflict and hate that get planted, in places, whether it's the United States or Mexico, by the pressure of too many people coming. And that's the biggest social risk of migration once this process begins. Another of Meredith's photographs in Mexico. So the goal was to pair this field reporting with what we could learn from the data. we began working with an incredible volume of data, which could help just sort of generalize some of the very specific stories and the anecdote stories, and tell, if the story that I hear from Jorge or from Elvira is representative in the masses, and help ensure that the anecdotes that I use are representational. The data is both difficult to work with and an opportunity to tell more stories. I want to just share a couple of those examples of how we ended up using it. This is the opening sequence for the New York Times Magazine piece. And late in my reporting, a study was completed and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that mapped the zones in which people live on the planet, and basically looked at where they've lived for the past 6,000 years and where they'll live, in the future, or where those temperate zones will move to in the future. And the message of that, which was really not necessarily the focus of the paper, but an easy takeaway from the data itself, was that about 1% of the world is barely livable today. And these are the places where you'll find climate migration happening today and the most climate-related hardship. But that by 2070, that portion will grow to almost 1 in 5 places on the planet. And in the appendices of the paper, you see the data that's also 1 in 5, just about 1 in 3 of the population of the planet. And that's the same whether you look at today's population lives in those places that will change, or the projected population of 9 billion people by 2070. So that was just one way to frame this question of where will they go. But I mentioned we had this this goal of using the ultimate of completing the ultimate data analysis, this sort of crystal ball artificial intelligence, and to that end, we learned that the modeling was crazy complicated. We worked with this guy Brian Jones, who's a geographer at Baruch College, who had developed the World Bank model. Jones, over the past 10 years, had developed an algorithm that began to do answer the sorts of questions that we're asking, and then we refined it to look at this particular region in Central America, and to incorporate new data related to climate, like specific groundwater data, specific changes in aridity and crop yields across Central America, and so forth. And that model incorporated a matrix of standard climate analysis used by the United Nations. So both what's called the RCPs, the representative concentration pathways for carbon dioxide, and also what's called the socioeconomic pathways, called SSPs, which are various scenarios for how global development will evolve over time. And it's basically a choose your own adventure of how the world progresses. And some of those SSPs would assume that we aggressively address climate risk and invest heavily in international aid and have open borders. And some of those SSPs assume that we do nothing to address climate risk, that emissions continue to skyrocket, that climate change gets very bad, and at the same time, perhaps we curtail what our foreign aid investments are. And when we consider having a little data freeze, hold on. Can you hear me still okay?
Yep, we hear you. Thank you.
You hear you? Okay. My screen is frozen. I apologize for that. So we created a matrix of the SSPs to look at a range of scenarios: high climate change and low global development, or high climate change and rapid global development. And we got a range of responses and a very clear set of choices. And this second set of images is our effort to visualize what happens. What you see in the orange here is projections for that rapid urbanization that I described, and what you see in sort of the cavity sections of the map here is how you get an evacuation essentially from the countryside in these places. And that represents this kind of this failure of agriculture, failure of rural communities' ability to grow their own food, and their perhaps desperate first move to the cities. And this is a scenario in which there's relatively open borders with the US and foreign aid continues. And we found that in that scenario, that's where there's a very large number of climate-related refugees or migrants who wind up moving towards the United States. On the order of about 1.5 million a year in general, and specifically related to climate, a couple 100,000 people. And to explain that differentiation, we had degrees of certainty about the numbers that we're seeing. So it's a smaller number to say that we're very confident that climate is the primary or sole driver of those migrants moving. A larger number to say that we estimate total number of migrants and climate probably played or did play some smaller role. And we know that because the number of migrants, the model tells us, increases as the climate warms. But another scenario that the model gave us is what happens when the US closes its borders. What happens when the US, for example, cuts off foreign aid, as we've begun to see in Central America. And when that happens, you have fewer migrants move to the United States, but you have a more intense and rapid urbanization and a very sharp population growth in these countries. So birth rate declines reverse and start to rise because the economies suffer with both the overpopulation and a lack of foreign aid. Poverty deepens. There still is no solution for the environmental changes in these rural communities. So their food insecurity increases, their crop yields continue to decline, and hunger grows, all with hotter weather and less water. And is really a recipe for a certain degree of misery. And so putting aside for a moment, the real broad or the real specific numbers that the model gives us, those sort of predictions. I mean, this was the big takeaway from what that data could tell us. And it was, that was what we had hoped to get out of the modeling process, which was really an experimental kind of process, because the modeling itself, we learned, and I learned through my reporting process, has great limits. So, as naive as it might have been to think that I could build a system that would artificially be able to predict the future with some certainty, I learned through that process that the modeling is imprecise and had to rely on an incredible number of assumptions, and that its real value was giving us those sort of general general directions for the future, and not the very specific figures or scary, estimates for how many migrants, for example, would move to the United States. So in the end, after all of this, after nearly 2 years of reporting, I mean, we did still have questions about whether the modeling, as much as we'd engaged in this interesting scientific process, whether it was bulletproof enough, whether it was reportable information. So that determined for us how it was used. And we decided through writing and the editing of the story that the search for this model, the search for for these figures and this data was part of the adventure. And that if the findings themselves were imperfect, that we would try to present them that way. And present them for the real challenges that they present to us. And it meant that the model was just one piece of information that informed this larger body of work, that the vast majority of the reported facts in the story came from that field reporting, come from outside research, come from the United Nations and peer-reviewed journals. But interestingly, the model for the great experiment that it has been also supported and correlated very well to what all of that research told us. And so it also meant that, to the extent that we reported the model results, that we needed to take extra steps to avoid this sort of sense of false precision, and to focus on those broad messages. And that's part of why, as I present the work to you now, I'm talking about what the differences are between those development pathways, for example, and not, just about whether we need to prepare for 1 million or 5 million or 30 million migrants at the US border. So this gives you a sense, I hope, of what was really an incredibly, complex project with enormous implications. To me, it validates things like the need for foreign aid, something that the GAO, the Watchdog Government Oversight Group, just came out and said a couple of weeks ago is an enormous failing of the current administration, the way we've cut off aid for food programs in Central America, the types of Greenhouse World Food Program development projects in El Salvador that I showed you that picture of. And it tells us that what we do, makes a difference, that the decisions that we make now to prepare either to handle the influx of migrants, coming to Mexico or coming to the United States, that what our country and their country does to support those people can lead to future stability, maybe economic growth. And then also what we do to support them at home makes a big difference in their need to leave, whether they have alternative crops, whether they have alternative growing mechanisms that can support ongoing agriculture as the climate continues to grow there. So with that, I'll turn it back to Hannah. I really look forward to answering questions and a deeper discussion and filling in whatever gaps I might have left, but that's the broad strokes of the project that we did.
Thank you so much, Abrahm. Can we just give Abrahm a giant round of virtual applause in our chat, or wherever we are, for being here with us and for sharing this really complex reporting in an accessible way. Thank you so much. And Pauline, I'll turn it over to you to answer some of the great questions that we got in the Q&A box during the presentation. And keep them coming.
Yes, again, thank you so much, Abrahm. We have some fabulous questions from our attendees, many of which I'm sure merit their own webinars. But the first one that we were wondering about is more of a process question. So from Anthony, how did you go about locating climate migrants like Jorge? And are you using the same tactics to locate US-based refugees?
Yeah, so I thought it might be hard, but it wasn't. I went to regions that I knew were suffering environmentally, and I knew that because of the research that we did, before those travels, talking to local scientists, looking at climate data, talking to the World Food Program, and so forth. And so by the time we got to those regions, everybody was a potential climate migrant. The challenge for me was choosing, which ones to put in the printed version of the story of the dozens of people that I met. And we spent an afternoon with a family whose son had just been in the news for dying at the U.S. border in a hospital in El Paso. Never reported as a climate migrant, but just found out about 2 years of hardship of starvation in that family. And this 16-year-old boy insisted against his parents' wishes and just left one morning. And everybody that I met was on the verge of leaving, was trying to figure out how to leave or save the money to leave, or how to escape from this situation. So the climate migrants were everywhere, and Meredith's experience, she has, many more years experience reporting, in the region, and also was equally surprised by the degree to which, everybody you asked had some environmental influence on their situation.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Abrahm. The next question is, we had a bunch of folks asking questions about terminology. So are the terms migrant and refugee interchangeable? And if not, what is the existing debate and the advantages and disadvantages of referring to someone as a climate refugee versus a climate migrant?
Yes, it's a great question, and unfortunately, it's a controversial subject, though not in my view. So the United Nations has a specific legal definition for what a refugee is, and a climate refugee is not technically a refugee. Refugee, according to the United Nations, is somebody who's been driven, from their home in response to, to an act of war or aggression, or some, personally threatening, destabilizing event like that. I think it's really important to talk about the kind of displacement that I'm seeing and we can expect from climate in terms of refugees, and that, a bureaucratic definition is not the same as, sort of a common language definition. And that is one of the ways that people can understand the situation that climate migrants, enter this transition period of constant movement and searching for a new home. Their land is not hospitable to them anymore, and they don't know where to land, and they would prefer to go nowhere at all.
Certainly, I think it's definitely important to use the proper terminology and to not be limiting, for sure. We have another question from Eve about how has the pandemic context affected your way of reporting on the ground? How did you adjust to these conditions? And did you have to find any imaginative solutions to access information due to the current circumstances?
So it would probably blow everyone's mind to know how long it took to put this project together, which meant that I did all of the travel and reporting for this before last March, before COVID really happened, for the most part. there's a second and a third story coming out, and they're much more affected by our limitations in reporting. The second story's got a little bit, but incomplete of travel-related reporting, and that's going to be a focus about how these issues affect where we live here in the United States. The third story, I was supposed to travel to Asia right about now, and it's probably not going to happen. And we're both considering whether it can still happen in the current environment, and and how to write the kind of story that that I've been putting together if it doesn't happen. And it's an enormous challenge. I mean, to try to get that blend of a real person experience and mix it with what the data says or what the research says, and to do that without seeing, hearing, talking to people, seeing with my own eyes what's happening is a real limitation. So I don't know, to be determined.
Definitely. And I know you may be giving us a sneak peek on another piece of reporting with this question, but someone else was wondering, while you were doing your research, did you examine any examples of climate-induced migrations within the United States as opposed to just internationally?
Yeah, so that'll be the subject of the next story. So stay tuned. Got about maybe 6 weeks or so, or 8 weeks to wait, and we'll go into that in quite a bit of detail.
We will be eagerly awaiting that piece, I'm sure. We have another question that someone is eager for your reflections on how do we kind of reconcile equatorial or developing or other nations wanting to kind of be a part of the quote unquote modern world, including things like infrastructure, cars, air conditioning, things like that, with the role that these developments play in ultimately propagating the climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's a moral and a philosophical question, and a hard one for me to answer. Except to say that as many of the UN experts that I talked to about from the International Organization of Migration would put it, mobility is a privilege in itself, and the ability to move, having that mobility is really the greatest form of freedom that everybody is really looking for, and perhaps entitled to seek out their best version of existence on this planet that they can muster. And that's how the migration was framed to me. But it's really kind of a similar thing when you look at what kind of development are they entitled to. I mean, could ask if we in the developed part of the world are willing to give up some of ours in order to allow some of theirs, or should they be less entitled to some of the things that we enjoy or benefit from than we should, just because we've come first, putting aside the really sort of sticky question of whether how much our coming first has put them in this situation that they're in the first place. So I wasn't going to share an opinion, but I guess my opinion is that yes, people are entitled to grow and evolve their communities, hopefully responsibly or in a green way now, but not with limits imposed by us.
Certainly, that's a really important reflection. And one other question we had is, what advice do you have for those of us watching, our students, other people in our communities, what is it that we can do about this issue? Or at the very least, how can we be better thinkers about these important issues?
Yeah, so on a sort of general level, I think understanding or beginning to look for the influence of climate change and environmental change in all of the issues that we talk about. It's there. It's kind of in every single one. So if you can begin to see the issues that you do care about through that lens, you'll see a lot more. You would never know that Edelvira in El Salvador was a climate migrant until you start to look at her situation and her story through those questions of sort of what caused her initial movement. So that's that's one thing. Another is to support the kinds of programs and policies that my reporting and I hope more reporting that follows as this evolves show are effective. And that ranges from we didn't talk about it today, but El Paso, Texas has already recognized that their economic growth, that the sales of the condos and the values of the condos they're building in that city, and the districts that they're trying to rehabilitate depend on planning for the migrants that are going to come, because they're going to come. And so you can build infrastructure and budget for those things and have affordable housing and have public transportation, or you cannot. And if you don't, then you'll have more poverty and more sort of destabilizing forces. And if you do, it can be better for those people who come and better for the communities that receive. And you know, the same thing for foreign aid too, to recognize that those things, those dollars make a big difference, and to support giving them, and it's probably a wise investment.
So true. Thank you for that reflection. And so, Abrahm, we are unfortunately right about at the end of our time. And so, before we hand it over to Hannah to wrap us up, I just want to give you an opportunity to share anything that you would like to leave us with today. Any final thoughts or recommendations or reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just said part of it, you know, which is that if you begin to look at these issues through the lens of climate change, or look at any issue through the lens of climate change, you can start to see its fingerprint. You know, I think that you know, the larger takeaway is that this is the kind of project and the kind of issue that starts to show, you know, the real human impacts of climate change. And we've spent, I think, you know, mainstream media, or, you know, general discussion, spent a lot of time looking at the science, debating facts and figures and degrees of warming or degrees of sea level rise and all of that. But in the end, none of that really matters except for how people experience it or suffer from it or benefit from it. And that's the conversation we should start to have. And this is one of about 10,000 stories you could do to start to explore that.
Well, all I can say is thank you so very much again, Abrahm, for being with us this evening. We're so proud to be a partner to you on this reporting and to help it reach more audiences. And yeah, thank you so much. If we could give another virtual round of applause to Abrahm in our chat for being with us today. And I think Hannah has a few things to say before we wrap up.
Thank you, Abrahm, and thank you, Pauline. We so appreciate all of you being with us and being wonderful participants today. Not only were your questions fantastic, but we so appreciate all of the resource sharing that's been going on in this chat. So thank you for that. Thank you for building this community. And we hope that you'll stay connected as well. As I mentioned earlier on in our webinar today, we have lots of opportunities for you to get involved this fall, whether you want to bring Abrahm or another journalist focused on climate migration or any other subject into your classroom to interact with your students. If you'd like to join us for some more professional development webinars, we have them upcoming on September 2nd and on September 16th, as well as many others throughout the fall. So please join us for those and stay in touch with us. We would love to connect with you directly. I am going to put up our email once again, education@pulitzercenter.org. So please reach out to us anytime, and we're happy to brainstorm with you how we can connect global issues and news stories into your curriculum for this upcoming school years to help students get more of this excitement and investment in the current issues that are facing our world today. You can also receive updates about the opportunities that we have upcoming and resources that we're developing by signing up for our weekly education newsletter. Today's webinar has been recorded, so we will be sharing that with you in a follow-up email in the next couple of days, along with this presentation and all of the links that you've seen. So if you want to go back through it, you'll be able to then. Once again, we just want to say thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your time and paying attention to setting aside hours for talking about underreported stories today, which is such an important thing to do in community together. So please stick around for the feedback survey, which will pop up as soon as we end this webinar, and tell us what you thought about this event, how we can make these better, how we can continue to interact with and support you going forward into this fall, into this school year, and the future beyond. Thank you so much, and take care, everybody.